Out on the winter seas, the cold wasn't just an enemy, it was an executioner. It crept into the lungs, turned rope to stone, and stripped the fight from even the fiercest men. One by one, the unprepared would vanish, claimed not by cannon fire, but by the slow, merciless hands of frost. Yet there were some who refused to bow to the ice. They wore its bite like armor, turned its silence into a shield, and made the freezing sea a weapon in their grasp. This is how they did it. Stay aboard until the last wave of this story, and you'll not only know the secrets that kept pirates alive in the dead of winter, you'll feel the cold at your back and the fire they carried in their hearts.
The cold was more than just an inconvenience. It was a silent predator that crept into the bones, slowing the mind, numbing the hands, and stealing the will to fight. On the open sea, in the dead of winter, that predator was everywhere. The wind sliced through cloth and skin alike, rolling off waves that carried the bite of distant ice fields. A man who lost his warmth at sea did not last long. Pirates knew this truth well. And so, in the unforgiving seasons, when the water turned black and the horizon disappeared into sheets of snow, they devised ways to keep themselves alive, fierce, and ready to strike. These were not the ramshackle, drunken crews of myth, forever stumbling under the weight of rum. No, when survival demanded cunning, they became craftsmen of warmth, masters of body and mind against the cold. The question is, would you have survived among them, or would the sea have claimed you before the next sunrise? On the deck of a pirate ship in January, the air was a constant battle. Frost clung to ropes, turning them into stiff, cracking snakes that had to be beaten back into shape before they could be used. Sails iced over, becoming heavy sheets that resisted the wind. But it was the human body, fragile and stubborn, that needed the most care. To keep warm, pirates often layered every scrap of cloth they owned. Wool stolen from merchant ships, fur from hunting expeditions, canvas from torn sails stitched into crude coats. The captain's quartermaster, often the one with a mind for logistics, would decide who received the rarest and warmest finds. Wool from the Scottish Isles, fur from Russian trappers, or heavy cloaks taken from military officers, these were more than trophies, they were lifelines. If you were on that deck, would you fight for a coat, or would you watch it go to someone with more favor than you? Yet warmth was not only a matter of fabric, it was fire, though fire on a wooden ship was a dangerous gamble. In the galley, deep below deck, pirates kept small braziers or iron stoves, their coals glowing like captured embers of the sun. Here, warmth radiated outward, drawing the crew into a cramped circle where hands thawed and faces softened in the flicker of light. But the captain knew the risk. Too much heat, too close to dry wood, and the ship could be ash before the night was over. So warmth was rationed like gold. Those who worked the hardest or had the trust of the officers found themselves nearest to the glow. The rest learned to work warmth into their bodies through motion, hauling ropes, scrubbing decks, climbing the rigging, never stopping long enough for the cold to take root. And then there was the cunning use of the sea's own gifts. Pirates in the far north learned from the whalers and fishermen who had braved those waters for generations. They lined the insides of their coats with sealskin or oil-soaked canvas, creating a barrier against wind and spray. Whalebone scraps were boiled into a kind of glue and smeared onto fabric to make it stiff and weatherproof. Some captains ordered barrels of rendered whale oil kept not for lamps, but for the crew's skin, a foul-smelling, slick layer that trapped heat and repelled freezing water. It made them reek, yes, but it also made them endure storms that would have crippled other crews. Could you have stood the stench for the sake of survival? Even the way pirates slept was a strategy. Hammocks hung close together below deck, not just to save space, but to share body heat. Men slept in their clothes, boots still on, wrapped in blankets scavenged from every raid. Those on watch during the coldest hours often carried heated stones wrapped in cloth, pressed to their chests or tucked under their arms. In brutal cold, some crews even slept in shifts in the warmest spots, rotating like soldiers guarding a treasure. Warmth was not a luxury, it was a form of discipline, enforced with the same severity as the ship's battle orders. But perhaps the most important warmth came from within. Rum, contrary to romantic tales, was not the cure for cold. It dulled the senses and slowed the blood. Instead, pirates favored hot infusions, tea stolen from East Indiamen, herbs from plundered ports, even boiling seawater mixed with whatever spices they had on hand. These brews were not about taste, but about survival, filling the belly with heat that could last through hours of icy wind. To drink it was to feel life return to the fingertips, the clarity sharpen in the mind. And a sharp mind was what kept them alive when enemy sails appeared on the horizon. You might think warmth was a small matter compared to cannons and cutlasses, but on those waters, in the shadow of winter storms, it was the difference between a crew ready to fight and a crew ready to die. For pirates, to stay warm was to stay dangerous. And danger, after all, was their greatest weapon.
The sea in winter was a master of cruelty, and it tested not only the body, but the mind. Warmth was not simply a physical state, it was a shield against despair. A frozen crew was a silent crew, and silence bred thoughts of mutiny, sickness, and death. Captains who understood this ruled not only with the promise of gold, but with the cunning distribution of comfort. Those who controlled the warmth controlled the crew's loyalty. A man who could sleep without his teeth chattering was more willing to fight, more willing to obey. In this way, blankets became as valuable as bullets, and a steaming pot of broth could command more respect than a chest of silver. There were stories whispered among the waves about captains who used the cold as a weapon against their own men. The cruelest of them rationed heat not for survival, but for control. A troublemaker might find himself posted on night watch in a snowstorm, his coat accidentally misplaced. The lesson was always the same. Comfort was a privilege, not a right. Yet in the hands of a clever leader, the opposite could be true. Reward the loyal with warmth, and they would face even the fiercest gale without complaint. It was a balance of fear and favor, as delicate as any game played between predator and prey. Could you have kept your loyalty in such a game, knowing that warmth was the leash around your neck? Beyond the human mind, there was the constant threat of the sea itself turning against the ship. Ice formed on the rigging, adding dangerous weight to the masts, threatening to snap them like twigs. Crews developed an unspoken rhythm to combat this, men climbing the rigging with hammers, breaking away the frozen chains of frost before they dragged the ship into the depths. Their fingers, stiff and raw, gripped the lines with the desperation of men who knew that hesitation could doom them all. Below deck, others worked tirelessly to keep water from freezing in barrels, rotating them, stirring them, even pouring in hot stones to break the ice. A single frozen barrel could burst, wasting precious fresh water and sending a ripple of panic through the ship. And still, pirates found ways to twist the cold into an advantage. In certain northern waters, they learned to use frozen decks to their benefit during boarding actions. Before an ambush, the crew would coat parts of their own deck in ice, leaving the pathways they knew bare and dry. When enemy boarders leapt aboard, they would find themselves slipping, falling, and scrambling while the pirates moved like shadows through the chaos. It was a cruel and brilliant tactic, turning the very season into a weapon. Could you have kept your footing, sword in hand, while death waited for the first man to fall? The animals on board, cats to keep the rats away, parrots stolen from warm ports, even the occasional monkey,
were as much a part of the ship's warmth as any blanket. The crew sometimes kept them close at night, huddled together for shared heat. The small life, the scratch of claws against cloth, reminded them of something beyond the endless cold horizon. But such warmth was fragile. When the temperature dropped too far, animals died quickly, and their absence was felt as much in spirit as in comfort. There was also the matter of illness. Cold seas were fertile ground for scurvy, frostbite, and the kind of lung sickness that could sweep through a ship in days. To prevent this, pirates used every scrap of knowledge they could gather. They rubbed their skin with animal fat to keep it from splitting. They forced themselves to breathe deeply in the open air, even when the wind felt like knives, to keep their lungs strong. In ports, they hunted for citrus fruit and onions, not because they cared for the taste, but because they understood, in their rough and instinctive way, that sickness could kill faster than a cannonball. Warmth in this sense was not only about the heat of the body, but the preservation of the life within it. Cold did not just harden the body, it sharpened instincts. The pirate who survived the frost was one who learned to read the smallest signs, the way the wind's voice changed before a snow squall, the shift in the color of the sea before ice formed. These observations were not written in any logbook. They were passed from sailor to sailor in half-spoken warnings, in the way a hand lingered on a rope or a glance was thrown to the clouds. On a winter voyage, such knowledge was as valuable as steel. You too would have needed these instincts because hesitation could mean freezing where you stood before the ship's bell tolled the next watch. The ship itself became a living thing under winter's pressure. The timbers groaned as the cold tightened their joints. Tar between the planks cracked and had to be sealed over again with whatever pitch or resin could be found. Crewmen worked in pairs, hammering in wedges or pressing hot tar into gaps with cloth-wrapped hands. Every repair was a fight against time, for the cold didn't just seep in, it invaded. The sea seemed determined to claim the ship plank by plank. Even the sound of the cold was unnerving. The creak of frozen rigging, the sudden crack of ice breaking off a spar, the faint, constant hiss of snow on wood. It was a music of survival, one that only the hardened could bear to hear without dread. In those months, warmth became a form of currency. A pair of dry gloves could be traded for favors. A scrap of fur could be bargained like coin. Those who knew how to mend torn garments or patch holes in boots became suddenly important, protected by the value of their skills. The cleverest pirates understood this and hoarded what others would overlook: scraps of cloth, bits of leather, lengths of rope that could be unraveled and rewoven into mittens or scarves. Would you have been one of those cunning hoarders, or the desperate soul willing to trade a week's rations for a pair of warm socks? At night, the air below deck grew thick with the smell of damped wool, unwashed bodies, and seawater. Men lay so close their breath mingled, turning the space into a heavy fog of human heat. Here, the cold was kept at bay by numbers alone. The sound of the sea above was muffled, replaced by the rhythm of sleep. Snores, muttered dreams, the occasional cough that sent a ripple of unease through the room. Each man knew that one fever could sweep through the hammocks like fire through dry tinder. The cold made the body vulnerable, and the crew's survival depended on every man staying fit to fight. Sometimes the ocean offered strange gifts to the winter voyager. Dead whales, frozen and drifting, could be hauled in for their blubber, fuel for lamps, grease for boots, warmth for the skin. Icebergs, dangerous yet alluring, could be chipped for fresh water. But both came with risk. A frozen carcass could attract predators, sharks, orcas, even the lurking shape of a rival ship hoping to ambush while the crew was distracted. An iceberg could shift and roll without warning, crushing a boat and its men. In winter seas, nothing was free, not even warmth. There were moments, however, when the cold seemed to retreat. if only for a while. The sight of the aurora spilling green fire across the sky could silence even the roughest deckhound. In that strange light, the cold became part of something beautiful, something almost worth the suffering. Men swore the lights were omens. Some said they promised safe passage. Others whispered they were the souls of drowned sailors watching over the living. Whether truth or superstition, they gave the crew a reason to endure another night, to haul another rope, to face another dawn with frozen fingers. And dawn in winter seas was a slow, pale thing. The sun rose reluctantly, spilling only a thin light over the water, as though it too feared the cold. But with daylight came motion. Men roused from their hammocks, fire coaxed back to life in the galley, and the ship groaning into another day's voyage. Every task completed in that cold was a victory, and the crew counted them all. To keep warm was to keep moving. To keep moving was to stay alive. And for pirates, staying alive meant keeping their grip on power, on plunder, and on the fear their names carried across the seas. In the harshest weeks of winter, even the act of breathing felt like a contest against the elements. The air cut sharp into the lungs, forcing men to draw in shallow breaths unless they willed themselves otherwise. The seasoned ones knew to breathe deep, slow and steady, as if telling their bodies, "You will not surrender to the cold." This discipline was as vital as a sharp cutlass. The sea had a way of teaching it quickly. Those who failed to master their own breath often found themselves weakened, shivering, and unable to work the rigging when it mattered most. And in a pirate crew, weakness was an invitation for someone else to take your place. The cold was merciless toward the unprepared, but the pirates who thrived on frigid waters treated it as a sparring partner rather than an unbeatable foe. They trained their bodies through constant exertion. The work never stopped. Hauling lines, scraping ice from the deck, moving cargo in the hold to prevent it from freezing to the boards. These were not just chores, they were survival drills. Motion generated heat, and heat kept the blood quick. Even punishment was sometimes designed with the cold in mind. A man caught shirking duty might be sent to chip ice from the hull for hours on end, his hands aching and raw by the time he returned. It was brutal, but it kept the ship from being dragged under by its own frozen weight. Food took on new meaning in the cold. A warm meal was more than nourishment. It was morale in a wooden bowl. Pirates adapted what they could find or steal. Salted meat boiled into stews thick enough to hold heat. Dried beans and lentils cooked until they were soft and filling. And whatever herbs they could smuggle aboard to flavor the pot. The galley became a sanctuary, its warmth guarded fiercely by the cook, who knew that a pot of hot stew could quiet arguments and ease the weariness in a man's bones. On the coldest days, the captain himself might appear to ladle out rations, a calculated gesture that reminded the crew who held their comfort in his hands. And yet, despite all the cunning and preparation, there were nights when the cold seemed unstoppable. Frost would creep inside the cabin walls, and the breath of sleeping men would turn to ice crystals that clung to the beams above. In those moments, the pirates relied on each other in the simplest, most human way, by sharing heat. 2 men would sleep back to back under a shared blanket, or 3 would huddle together in a hammock meant for one. Pride and rank mattered less than the warmth of another body. To refuse such closeness was to risk waking up dead. Would you have swallowed your pride, or would the cold have stolen you before dawn? The ships that sailed through such winters often bore scars of their survival, patched sails that had been frozen solid and torn in the wind, ropes spliced together from a dozen different raids, decks worn smooth from the constant scraping away of ice. These scars were badges, each one a story of a battle fought against the season itself. And just as a scar on a man's skin could inspire fear in an enemy, the weathered look of a winter-hardened ship could send a shiver down the spine of those who spotted it on the horizon. Pirates understood that reputation was as important as strength, and winter offered them a stage for building it. Tales would spread in the ports about crews who had vanished into ice-choked waters and returned months later with their ship intact, their gold untouched, and their eyes colder than the seas they had sailed. The unspoken truth was that not all had returned. Those who had fallen to frostbite, sickness, or the relentless hunger of the sea were simply erased from the story. But their absence only added to the myth, turning survival into legend. There were even those among the pirates who sought out the cold, believing it tempered both crew and captain alike. To them, enduring a winter voyage was proof of worthiness, a mark that separated the common raider from the true predator of the seas. They sailed not just for plunder, but for the sharpening of the soul that only the cold could provide. And when they emerged into warmer waters, their confidence was as tangible as the steam rising from the sea at dawn. Winter at sea was a thief that took without asking, and every pirate who sailed those months knew it. Fingers lost their feeling first, then ears, then the edges of thought itself. A man could be alive one moment and gone the next, claimed not by cannon or blade, but by the invisible grasp of frost. This knowledge bred a certain ruthlessness in the crew's habits. Every movement was deliberate, every breath measured, every choice a calculation between wasting energy and preserving heat. Survival was no accident. It was a discipline, enforced daily until it became instinct. The cold also reshaped the way pirates fought. Battles in freezing seas were short, sharp affairs because both sides knew that lingering too long in the wind was a death sentence. Boarding maneuvers were timed to avoid the worst gusts. Grappling hooks were thrown quickly, lines tightened fast, and the fight decided before ice could turn the deck into a killing ground of its own. Weapons, too, were adapted for winter. Blades kept close to the body so they wouldn't freeze to the hand. Pistols wrapped in cloth to keep the metal from biting the skin. Powder was guarded from moisture with almost religious care. A misfire in warm weather was a setback, but in winter, it could mean total disaster. The ship itself became an ally in warmth if treated wisely. Canvas awnings were strung across parts of the deck to break the wind. Spare sails soaked in oil were used to cover hatches and block the icy draft. In extreme conditions, crews even built temporary wooden walls on deck, turning sections of the ship into windbreaks that could mean the difference between life and death during a long voyage. Such modifications slowed the ship and demanded effort to maintain, but they bought the crew time, and time was survival. There was an art to dressing for the cold, one learned by experience and necessity. Wool against the skin for warmth even when wet. Layers of fabric that could be stripped or added depending on the wind. Leather and fur as armor against the spray. Some pirates carried extra cloth inside their belts, ready to wrap around hands or feet during sudden storms. They knew that once cold claimed the extremities, the rest of the body would soon follow. And while the sea was unforgiving, it was not without lessons. Every voyage taught new tricks, new methods to cheat the winter. But even the best tricks could fail in the face of the sea's fury. There were nights when the wind roared so loud it swallowed all thought, when the snow fell sideways, stinging like shot, and the deck vanished beneath a shifting skin of ice. In those hours, pirates moved like shadows, bound together by trust and necessity. Orders were barked only when essential. Most communication came in gestures, the quick grip of a shoulder, the nod toward a task. Speech was a luxury the cold would not allow. And in the midst of it, each man kept a small, silent fire burning in his mind, the knowledge that dawn would come, that the storm would pass, and that he would not be the one left behind, frozen in place like a forgotten figurehead. Perhaps the strangest thing about the cold seas was how they changed the pirate's sense of time. Days and nights blurred, not marked by the sun, but by the cycle of watches and the moments of heat, a hot drink, a turn by the brazier, a dry pair of socks. Victories were measured in hours survived without frostbite, in sails repaired before the wind returned, in barrels kept from freezing solid. These small triumphs wove themselves into the larger rhythm of survival, and when the crew finally reached warmer waters, they carried those habits with them like invisible scars. In the end, the pirates who conquered the cold were not those who defied it, but those who learned to work with it, who treated the cold as a constant companion, sometimes cruel, sometimes silent, always demanding respect. They knew that warmth was never given freely on the open sea. It was earned, stolen, and guarded like treasure. And those who mastered that truth sailed on, harder than iron, sharper than ice, and with eyes that told the world they feared nothing, not even the coldest seas.